My name is Madiha Tahir, and I'm a Mellon postdoctoral research fellow at the Center for Imagination in the Borderlands at ASU. Today's event marks the final virtual conversation for this series, Technologies of Power, but do stay tuned for what's next on our website, technologiesofpower.com. Our conversation today is going to be about art's relationship to politics. Over the last 20 years of the war on terror and now the rise of fascism domestically and internationally, artists have played an interesting role in commenting on and intervening in political debates in interesting ways. Sometimes this has not been without controversy, with art exhibitions being sometimes shut down. In one case for quote unquote glorifying terrorism. So this is some of the issues that we're going to be talking about today. And we have three wonderful artists to speak with us. So I'm going to turn it over to Adrien to introduce.
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Adrian Zakar and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Toronto. Today's event is happening in collaboration with the Highline Art, and we will introduce our partner shortly. But first, we're excited to have to host our three art practitioners here. So our first speaker today is Tamara Abdelhadi. And Tamara is an Iraqi photographer whose work is concerned with the historic and contemporary representation of her own culture in all of its diversity. Along with being a photographer, Tamara is an educator who has given photography workshops truly across the Arab world. Tamara was a founding member of Rawiya Collective, a photography cooperative of female photographers in the Middle East. Welcome, Tamara. Our second speaker today is Yvonne Argot. Yvonne is a Colombian artist and film director based in Paris. Through his sculptures, installations, films, and intervention, he questions our relationship with others, with power structures, and with belief systems. Yvonne develops strategies based on tenderness, affect, and humor, through which he generates critical approaches to dominant historical narratives. And our third speaker today is Asiyabundawi. Assia is an Algerian-American investigative journalist and documentary filmmaker. Her award-winning feature-length documentary, The Feeling of Being Watched, investigates a decade-long FBI surveillance in the filmmaker's Muslim American community. It has had its world premiere at the 2018 Tribeca Film Festival and was then nationally broadcasted on PBS. Welcome, everyone.
So we're very excited for this conversation today, but first I want to introduce our partner at the Highline, Melanie Kress. Melanie is the Associate Curator for Highline Art in New York, where since 2014 she has commissioned and produced projects with hundreds of artists. Previously, she was Director and Chief Curator for the project space Concrete Utopia in Brooklyn. She holds a BA in Art History and Visual Arts from Barnard College, and an MA in Contemporary Art Theory from Goldsmiths University of London. So I'm going to hand it over to Melanie, who will tell us a bit about the Highline's current exhibition on drone warfare, and who will start us off with some framing and some questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madiha and Adrian and Yvonne and Assia and Tamara for being here today. The context for this conversation is really an exciting overlap in interests and topics between Highline Art and Technologies of Power and their amazing ongoing conversations. Highline Art, if you're not familiar, is the public art program presented on and around the Highline. We present projects every year in a wide range of formats, ranging from performances to film programs to sculptures and installations. And in 2021, just last year, we opened the second commission in what's called the Highline Plinth series, which is a dedicated location on the Highline for rotating monumental scale art commissions. And this piece is an artwork by an artist named Sam Durant called Untitled Drone. And it's a large scale fiberglass sculpture in the shape of an abstracted predator drone sitting on top of a 25-foot steel pole. And the artwork can rotate in the wind like a weather vane. It's very abstracted. There are no cameras or weapons, but the artwork is also visible if they're walking or driving up 10th Avenue or down 30th Street as well. And with this artwork, the artist intends to increase visibility around intentionally obscured drone warfare and surveillance perpetuated by the US. The work really continues our mission of showing artworks that challenge us to think in new ways about the most important questions of today. And so in support of the goals of this piece, we've organized a wide array of educational and interpretive programs, including 2 symposia over the last couple of years and collaborations like these with other collaborators, including the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project and the Viralist Center. And so I say all of this because it will also ground up a lot of our conversation of thinking about art, how it can invite us to think differently, how it can be mobilized for different purposes, and also the challenges and opportunities in terms of presenting education and other kinds of interpretive materials around an artwork. But I really wanted to highlight 2 topics that have come up in many of these conversations. And the first is a sentiment championed really by the work of our colleagues at the Viralist Center. And that is that artists can be researchers and are researchers in their own right. And that artistic creations offer insights into the world around us that can be in dialogue with the research of scientists, academics, and other research practitioners. And the second sentiment, and really the foundation and the original inspiration for this conversation today, is that artists really have the unique opportunity to help us to see and think differently outside of our daily assumptions, to overturn the kinds of worldviews that are actively fabricated around us. So much, as we've discussed many times in our planning for this event, of the work of many of the wings of the war on terror is the continued fabrication of a kind of fear and otherness that enables public support for these wars and the technologies that undergird them. And much of this fabrication can really happen through creative mediums of film and television, in addition to news and public media. And so throughout this conversation, I really want to think about these 2 sides of thinking about art as a form of uncovering our world knowing or coming to know, and a form of imagination creation or world building. And so to start us out, I want to ask each of our panelists today to think about how your practice, how you think of it as a kind of uncovering or creative research or a way of looking for answers and reflections in the world around us, especially in the space of conflict or thinking about the different contexts for these different symposia. Maybe Assia, we'll start with you.
Sure. I think a lot of my work is about like erased histories. I'm curious in like, I mean, just to ground all of this, I've as a result of my last documentary film, I filed a lawsuit against the FBI for the surveillance records of my neighborhood, and in the lawsuit won something like 30,000 records. 30,000 pages of records, and that are like 75% redacted. So, as a journalist, this is like supremely frustrating, this disappearing of information. And at the same time, it also forced me to confront that, like, there's so many erasures beyond just like the text that's been disappeared, and like what's been erased is also like our experience. The other side of the people who were watching and asking the questions was our experience of it, and also our own archive. So confronting this like large bureaucratic secret archive forced me to think about not like the space of possibilities within the redactions, not just about information that's been disappeared, but what are the stories that, what are our stories that have been like, subjugated to this larger dominant narrative, and how can we exploit, the aesthetic of the redaction to create a physical space for, the community's archive and our own historical stories. So I think so much of my work has to do with uncovering, but also like, confronting the black holes, and understanding that there's like still data that can be derived from the black hole. And beyond that, like, I think like who, like uncovering what. For such a long time, I was like really focused on fighting this legal battle to uncover the actual text behind the redacted spaces, and only to realize that it's not so much uncovering as it is like, the impetus is actually to preserve our own archive, to preserve how we saw ourselves, like our home video recordings of ourselves, for an imagined future. And it's as much about uncovering as it is about preserving something else.
Such a great place for us to start. Tamara, maybe I think it'd be nice to ask you next to take up the question.
Yes, hi. Just a small disclaimer, I'm in Beirut, so internet might be choppy. So if I, just letting you know, let me know if you can't hear me or if I freeze. I mean, coming in after Assia, I think one of the words that I picked up from her was curious. And I think for me, my work started as a photographer out of my own curiosity. And when I first became a photographer, I ended up as a photojournalist, not by choice, but really by chance. I was looking for work and I was trying to find my way as a photographer, and I got a job as a photojournalist, and I worked for Reuters and I worked for the New York Times, and I was young and it was exciting. And then I started realizing more and more that I was, creating the visual for writing that I didn't write, and the sort of that narrative that is dominant in the news that we always hear about, that is always repeated all the time, specifically about the Middle East and North Africa. And so I feel as though, for me, coming into photography as a journalist and then realizing that I wanted more than just being like the visual piece for somebody else's writing, I pushed myself more into photographing projects that I was curious about, photographing stories that I wanted to know more about and I wanted to share, starting or co-founding Grauya Collective, which was at the time something very exciting in 2010, I believe, when we joined forces. I joined forces with 5 other women photographers from the same region. This was also something about, this feeling of wanting to share, wanting to uncover what's underneath all of these, perpetuated stories that we keep hearing. So this, for me, is how I think how that fits into the work I do. And then moving forward into now and the kind of work that I do, I very much am concerned with the historic and contemporary representation visually and photographically of this region that I call home. So, and it would be, anywhere between Beirut and Baghdad and, anywhere in between. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. And that is my journey that I'm still on. So, yeah.
Thank you. Yvonne?
Hi, I'm very happy to be here. And like many kind of notions and ideas came to my mind listening to everybody. I think from my own practice, I work more as I'm a visual artist. I work in, I would say, sculpture, installation. I do a lot of films also, and I think half of my time I'm doing a film, half of my time I'm doing, actually at the same time, working on some installations. And the films are for me the field of research, and the kind of installations are kind of a field more of experimentation. I think I do both. But about I work a lot about public space and different notions around public space, either how public space which are the political narratives in public space, how things are decided, which are the policies that kind of make this or this happen. And then in terms of this uncovering, on my case, I like to dig or to kind of make researches about how the city is this way, why the national days are chosen, who make those decisions. There's no, public space is not at all a democratic space most of the time. It's like not everybody, I have not voted ever in my life to have a monument or a statue. So it's just political decisions that have been made by power in place in certain points. And then it kind of it's perpetuated by a kind of non-movement, because we let these things stay, and then they remain and they become natural to have like either, I don't know, slavery people or like colonialist monuments, or it becomes kind of normal to have all kind of this aggression around. So my idea is either kind of uncover kind of what is under the surface and see why is it there, and then also kind of try to watch again and like let's see with new eyes And then let's try to see that it's not maybe normal to have this thing or to have this thing and to honor this person, or maybe it's just as simple as not even to make decisions for other people to like take something out or not, but more like let's talk about this. No, this is an issue, and then it doesn't need to be ignored. So most of the research I do is related to that, to like, I don't know, for example, Columbus Day, who invented that? And then it was not a celebration some years ago, and it was actually the Spanish who decided when they lost Puerto Rico and Cuba that they need to have to celebrate the imperial past. So they decided to make a day that was called the Day of Spanish Race. That's in the 1920s. It's just kind of recent. And then now there's the National Day in Spain, for example. So it's like, meanwhile in America, in the Americas, we're kind of discussing about changing either this day to another, celebrate another thing. In Spain, they still have this as a national day. So you kind of start discovering, and in Colombia, for example, it's called Día de la Raza, the race day. It's mixed with this Spanish race day, but it just got Spanish. So you understand a little by little how this kind of this patrimony, it's a kind of a weird collage of either kind of powers that try to impose on top of each other. So I think my work sometimes is kind of try to take out this collage and dig out to see and try to see how is it built, and also mostly today how we could generate a new narratives and kind of precisely in public space. So it's pretty much about that.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for this first round of answers. As we got together, Madiha, Melanie, and I, in preparation for this event, we had lots of conversations about questions that you just mentioned here, the idea of erasure, experience, archive, what's been home, what is home, what's made by non-movement, and collages, the sort of variety of meanings that a collage can take. And so one thing that kept on coming back, and I think that you really touched upon here, like maybe at the heart of it, is this idea of, the power of the artist to make the unseen seen again, or to reshuffle and reassemble the real in ways that are surprising and so, in unexpected configurations. In a sense that hold political power and that yield new forms of mobilizations. So we're really glad that you started with commenting on how, the everyday of your practice engages in this world making, or some would say this ontology building practice. And so now we'd like you to take it from the other side of the spectrum, perhaps from the political. So these are the two sides of the spectrum that we sort of had in our conversation, the world making on the one hand and the political on the other. And perhaps I'll leave it to Madiha to ask you another question then.
Sure. I was curious to hear from you in what ways you think 9/11 impacted the art space. And I realize that this in some ways is a US-centric question. But I also wonder whether, for instance, for you, Tamara, whether you felt a new kind of pressure or obligation in your photographic work to produce particular kinds of representations, and how you kind of thought about your work, each of you thought about your work post 9/11. There's a tendency, there's a question of art for art's sake and art being useful for mobilization or teaching purposes. And I wonder kind of where you land on that in terms of the post 9/11 kind of space. So maybe we'll begin with you, Tamara.
Yes, sure, Madiha. Thank you. So I lived in Canada. I was in Canada during 9/11. Actually, I was between Beirut and Canada, but I would say that the beginning of my own personal project as a photographer came around the early 2000s, maybe 2005 actually. And I started thinking about, I'll talk about one specific project that I worked on. And it's one that I actually just published into a book. And it's called Picture an Arab Man. And I started this project in 2008. And it was, at the time, I would say, in reaction to how I saw Arab men being portrayed. And, it's this whole, the oldest sort of trope that we always see of, I don't think I have to tell anyone here, like the Arab man being a terrorist, like a woman oppressor, like all kinds of pretty bad sort of negative stereotypes. And I kept seeing that in the media, and I kept seeing that in, in movies, and it has been for a really long time. But then I would say in the 90s, maybe after the Gulf War, a little bit after, just started coming a lot in films. And I really just I said to myself, I want to create something that like fights against that, but in a soft way. I don't want to do something that's really in your face. I don't want to scream it. I want to sort of, subtly share it. And so I started making these images of Arab men that I would say now are my own visual gaze of the Arab man. And it was a way that I wanted to make the Arab man softer. I wanted to not make him softer, but bring out the softness or gentleness that I saw in my father and my, partner and my brother and cousins and brother-in-law and uncles and, so on. And so that was why I did the project. At the time, it was reactive to this visual that I was really sick of seeing. And at the same time, but now I would say all of this time later, I would say that it's more of a celebration now as opposed to something that's reactive, because it was always a celebration to begin with. But yeah, I mean, my work has definitely been very affected by that. And I think that that's also because I lived in the West and in, in the Arab world. And I always felt like I was trying to make, I'm trying to make work for myself first and foremost, but also for, I was making work for the West, I think a lot, because I wanted that visual to break that stereotype or reach that person that might see it and have a different feeling or, another kind of idea. But I think now it's fast forward now, seeing the book in its finished form, I feel like I was making it, or I had made it for like the teenage Arab man to see perhaps himself in the book. And I think that if that would to happen, it would be like my success for the book. I think it would be a really beautiful way to think of it. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of how I was thinking about how my work is connected, I guess, to like the post 9/11. Yeah.
Thank you. Assia, I was wondering what you kind of, I mean, your work is in some ways very directly connected to conditions that, also occurred post 9/11, but also were happening prior. So I'm wondering kind of how you think about your documentary filmmaking and documentary filmmaking as a representational practice. Do you think of it as an objective truth genre, which is what how a lot of people think about documentary filmmaking, or kind of is it for you a space of artistic play, and how you deal with questions of visibility and strategic invisibility of the communities that you were working with and on?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would like to preface it by saying I really don't believe in this like post 9/11 dichotomy, because a lot of communities, I mean, Arab and Muslim communities in the US had been experiencing, profiling and targeted surveillance, for decades before, even in terms of forget the politics and state-sponsored investigations, just even in the popular culture. It's not only after 9/11 that Arab men started being depicted as terrorists, or like there's a long and old narrative that comes from from the Crusades, it's old, right? So yeah, anyway, just to say, I don't know that there was, we experienced, obviously it became on a national scale, but there were so many neighborhoods that were feeling this post 9/11 kind of anxiety, pre 9/11, for decades. And and I like to also like connect that like to the continuum of, you know, like repression of communities of color in the United States by like the Department of Justice and by the FBI. Like that's also like a long and old historical pattern. And anyway, just to say that. And also I was a kid, so I didn't have an artistic practice before 9/11. Yeah, I don't know. I also think that it's like, you know, I mean, for documentary film, for me, I came at it, you know, the first film I made was The Feeling of Being Watched. And I came at it, before that, I was a radio journalist. It was not even my medium, but I felt like if I was going to tell a story about being watched and surveillance, that it needed to be a visual medium to do that in. And so that was my foray into filmmaking, which I really, really like loved very much. And I enjoyed very much like this, this ability to really embody positionality with the camera, to, you know, there were so many like ways you can talk about surveillance, but like to try to like represent a feeling, you know, a preoccupation, like a way of moving in the world because you feel you're being watched, was something very special that only like cinema, I could only do in cinema. Couldn't be a print piece, you know, couldn't be a radio piece. So I appreciated that very much. I think I tend to think of them as like tools of telling a particular kind of story. So I don't know if I'm a filmmaker, like maybe I'll make another film, but like the work I'm working on right now is, you know, an artistic treatment of these 30,000 pages of documents. And it's like, it's not a film, it's actually an art installation. You know, we're creating like a full scale labyrinth using all of these documents. And in the redacted spaces, we're hiding, you know, the community archive that will be like triggered through augmented reality. And you'll be able to see videos of the community archive coming out of, you know, these redacted spaces. It's an experience also, like the experience of surveillance from constriction, you know, to expansion, the very center of, it's also a metaphor for this idea like that the opposite of surveillance is not privacy, it's community. So how could we like embody this metaphor physically? And so it was like, oh, this is not like a film either. This is like, you know, this is a co-created community art installation. It's site specific. We're building it in the neighborhood. So yeah, so I think like, I don't like to categorize these things separately. It's research, of course, and it's archival work. And it's also experimental in terms of process. Like now I'm working on this like non-single authored work. What does it mean to like create something that, or co-create something with so many people? And anyway, so yeah, I think it's all of those things at the same time. And it's also like disruptive, like this idea that like there's world making and then there's like the political, like, but world building is political, like world building, like imagining like a liberatory future is like the role of the artist, and because you have to imagine it before you can live it. And so what does that mean to imagine worlds that don't exist right now, you know, like, you know, and like organizing is like an act of imagination because you're like organizing and working towards a future that doesn't even exist yet. So like that's science fiction in itself, like what organizers and activists do. So I think like there's not clean categories for these things. And it's all everything at the same time, all at once, like that wonderful new film.
No, thank you so much, Assia. And it follows up so well on many themes that we've hit throughout this talk series about rethinking spatial and temporal orders of both, you know, surveillance, power, and resistance as well. And I think a question that we had for Iván that might really follow up nicely with your refusal to take, you know, the 9/11 as a temporal marker or temporal rupture is, you know, one of the pieces that Iván put together was stage the removal of the statue of a general at the center of Paris. Now, in doing so, it seemed to us, Iván, that there was a spatial process involved by which you brought on the European continent a statement and a practice that is much more common both in the Anglo-American world and perhaps in the New World. And so we were wondering, how does your position as perhaps an American, a South American artist, broadly speaking, how were you able to perform these acts of displacement in a perhaps a particular way, given your positionality? And perhaps you can answer the general question about politics post 9/11 too, if you wish. Thank you.
I was preparing for that at the beginning. Now you changed the question. No, to be quick, first on the 9/11, to just continue the conversation. I was in Colombia. I was still living in Colombia. I grew up there and then made university there. I was at university and I grew up in this militant family. So they're very all involved in politics. We are. And then just this, not only 9/11, but I mean, also this, but then Bush administration fits also. It was at the same time that the beginning of the Uribe era, which is was a very violent president. So the post 9/11 was a time of kind of fear, because they created, particularly in Colombia, the power of the United States in Colombia is very present, and then military wise, and then there's like proofs of collaboration with paramilitary armies, and the government at the time was really into forcing kind of paramilitary to fight guerrilla at the time. So all this language of terrorism already existed in Colombia since the narco-traffic times in the late 80s, early 90s, but then it was kind of reinforced, and then so the US installed themselves in Colombia. They put military bases, they reinforce this narrative of like terror, and then so in Colombia we're not an Arabic country, we don't have much Arabic immigration, but that means like unionists, like leftists, like opposites. So like those are the ones. If you are like a bit left, you are already categorized as a terrorist immediately by the government, and then people like journalists were followed or killed. Like Colombia is until today is the country where the most ambientalist people are killed in the world. Is the #1 place where like ambientalists are assassinated, and journalists also. So this, after the 9/11 thing, was this generate in Colombia precisely this collaboration, this military collaboration between the US and the kind of people in power in Colombia to just smash anything that is like against their corruption, against their own kind of colluding kind of relations in between mafia, paramilitarism, military, and like politics. So we're still kind of suffering from that, because the government of Uribe was like 2002 until 2010. Then it was followed by this other Santos, which is one of these ministers, to kind of make the step to make an peace agreement with the guerrilla. It was kind of a calm, more kind of peaceful time. But now it's back again, the Uribe party, and this far right wing is associated with the mafia, which is associated a lot with the kind of military policies in South America of the United States. That's been very toxic. And nowadays in Colombia, there was like in 2021, there was so many protests, and that actually kind of related with the second question, because the young people kind of were like had just enough, and then start like going out and just protest about policy and also about like public monuments. So indigenous communities participated in a lot of like, how do you say it, in removing monuments, colonial monuments in different cities. So now it's like nowadays there is a kind of a wind of change. Let's see how it works, because in Colombia you never know, like there's presidential elections in 3 weeks, and then we fear that like the candidate who is going to maybe to represent kind of the change, we fear he may be killed, or it's this kind of level. So I don't think it's necessarily linked with 9/11, but it's part of it, and it's part of like.
In our series, in past talks, we talked about that a lot, about the war on terror giving permission to governments across the world to engage in all sorts of repression. So this really echoes. We had someone to talk to us about China, for example. And so that's yet another example. Yeah.
And then to be quick about the Gallieni action, and then that was also part of my work, is like to make interventions, of course, without permission, or to transvestite or transform these monuments and question them, like physically, not only like from with ideas or text, but just go touch them and then do things on them. So Gallieni is this military figure from the late 1900s, 1800s, and the thing in France, like as I told you, in Colombia, it's a very present thing, and I've been working around monuments since about 12, 15 years, either doing interventions, make them disappear, or like doing stuff on them. But then in France and in Europe, they have this relationship with patrimony, which is very almost like holy in a way. It's almost like you cannot touch it, and then somehow they don't, at least in France, they allow themselves to criticize a lot the history of other places, but they don't allow themselves to criticize much their own colonial history. So, for example, there's no monument who has been removed or rethink or re-questioned or at all. So it was, I think, it's a necessity for, I think it needs to happen. I mean, the question needs to be asked. And so it was just a collaboration with Françoise Vergès, which is a very influent and important socialist, political scientist and militant. We make this film, which is actually a kind of, when you see the statue get removed, the statue of Gallieni get removed, it's a very, also a very horrible monument, because not only because what he represents in terms of the French colonies, but also because the pedestal is 4 naked women from 4 different races holding him. They represent the continents he dominated, so Asia, Africa, like let's say the Caribbean and Europe. So it's very misogynist too. And so we make this video when you see like a very banal situation where a crane and like workers, actually it was us, we dressed up as workers. It was just in front of the military museum, which is just a bunch of police and militaries in front and cameras all around. And just we dress as proper as we can as like public kind of workers. We put like the banners, and we came with a gigantic crane, all like very, and we act very calmly, like bored, you know, like a just a guy who's working and like has to remove a statue. So we attached the statue to the crane, and we didn't remove it because I don't think it's my place to do it. I think it's more like a common thing we need to do together. But we did it on like a fix. So I attached the statue to the crane, and then the last seconds of this video is like a fix where we scan the statue on 3D and we make it move. And then we publish this on a newspaper that is kind of a critical newspaper, I see, very serious. So it generates this kind of fake news, and it's like the first monument to get removed in France. So it kind of generates a little, like on Twitter, a little snowball in Twitter. And it was interesting to generate that debate. Yeah, and I think like, I think as our place, and I was talking to a friend today about that, sometimes where we are like immigrants in a country, like let's say me, I'm a South American in Europe, we sometimes are placed to in a spot where we are supposed to talk about our places, like explain me a little bit more about your place, and then talk me a bit about your politics. But I think it's the contrary. Sometimes we need to just explain around here what is their issue, what are their issues. And it's not like, no, I don't need to come here to talk about Colombia only. Like I could talk about Colombia, I happily can do it. But I think we need our eyes from other countries to come see, like here, let's say in Europe or in the US and in the power places, like what's not going on well, or something like that.
I'm going to dive in quickly. We want to talk a lot about visibility and invisibility also in this either dichotomy or false dichotomy that comes up a lot around surveillance. But Yvonne, with this piece that you staged in reality, in public space, that's both real and then is also fake when it goes into the online realm. Assia, I'm curious about the projections that you've been doing in public space and this kind of fascinating idea of taking the space of erasure and taking the space of invisibility to use it as an opening for representation again. But can you talk a little bit about the projections that you've been doing and maybe a play between invisible and visible, or reality and unreality in the lived experience of public space. And then Tamara, I'd love to hear from you also thinking about representation and visibility and invisibility in your different series.
Yeah.
Wait, who?
Please go ahead.
Yvonne, are you still here?
Yeah. Sorry, whose turn is it?
I was passing this to Assia and then to Tamara.
Yeah, cool.
Well, you must have some projections too, Yvonne. We want to hear about them as well. The projections, it was like a guerrilla intervention that we did in 2018 and 2019, where we projected the documents, or the redacted documents on the FBI headquarters in DC, the Hoover Building, and in New York at Titan Point, it's called, but it's the NSA. It's an NSA building that was like identified in one of the Edward Snowden leaks. But the idea was basically, first of all, to shine a light on what these otherwise innocuous seeming buildings actually do, right? And it was really interesting. I remember in Tribeca in New York, when we were doing the projections on this building, there was a theater across the street, and the actors were coming out of the theater, and they'd been there for years, and they had no idea what this building across the street was. And so we just had this, conversation in the middle of the intervention about that. I mean, it's so shining a light on what these, like, unlike the beyond like the bureaucratic, like what is actually the function, what is the what is the bureaucratic function, and what the operation of like the surveillance state looks like. We also did it in Washington, DC at the FBI headquarters. The idea that like the records of my family and community are housed in this building, and they're redacted here. They also housed here before all of the redactions, right? This is, and they'll be there in perpetuity, right? Because this is the thing about surveillance also. It's not just the act of watching without consent, right? It's also the act of recording what you see and then keeping those records and those archives forever and accessible to other government agencies. And so, yeah, the idea was to shine a light on the archive and to show how, how much was redacted. I made like some short films using my own family's home videos and records, like juxtaposing side by side, like this very, bureaucratic record that the FBI composed of us, in this like really, bureaucratic language, and like juxtaposing that with how we saw ourselves. And also this idea of like, to be watched but not seen, and what does it mean to be seen, and to have like a reciprocal gaze. It was very powerful. I mean, for me personally, it was a really powerful act to do it in the streets, and to have like, just whoever was there in those moments come and experience that. And it felt really cathartic. I think there's something about surveillance that requires you to have like a dirty secret with the people watching you. It's like there's a lot of shame about being criminalized and being targeted and watched. And so like that shame binds you in this like really kind of like secret. And when you show it out loud, when you project in public spaces, when you put it on their own buildings, it's really powerful to say like, this is not just between us, that this is like, it like breaks something, it disrupts something, it disrupts this like the one-way gaze, it's like, I'm watching you watching me. For me, it felt very personally cathartic, and I'd love to continue doing like more of these, like a no particular audience, like interventions in public space, and also doing them like in community and with community. And have some ideas planned for doing them in suburban Chicago, actually, also, because I think that experience can be very powerful for the surveilled. like that process itself. So yeah.
Tamara, could you maybe pick up this question about visibility and visibility representation, but maybe also working in with community and how like collective representation can be formed?
I mean, I would say one of the projects that popped in my mind when I think about community is this project I did where I photographed barber shops, and mainly like barbers and male self-care, basically, in refugee camp in Ramallah for displaced Palestinians, internally displaced, and then another one here in Beirut for a Syrian refugee. Abdul was the owner of that barbershop. And for me, that was, one part curiosity, one part also wanting to see these, document and visualize these really beautiful hairstyles and, self-care routines of these communities that are, in essence, sort of not very visible. And I always noticed that their hairstyles were very visible, that they would, wear them with pride, and there would be different hairstyles in the different refugee camps, for example. And I was very curious, and I spent my first barber that I met and connected with was in Ramallah, and his name was Tamar, and he had a small barber shop in the Qalandia refugee camp in Ramallah. And he was so proud, a very proud barber, loves his work, loves his art and what he does, and takes part in these worldwide hairdressing championships representing Palestine. And I was so inspired by him, and it sort of grew through him, this project, because I went to Gaza, and he connected me with his friend, Ahmed, a barber there who had just self-published the Encyclopedia of Hairdressing in Gaza, which was just really amazing. And so this idea really for me was first wanting to know what, I want to know. I said, Tamar, are there different hairstyles in this camp, or are there different hairstyles in the other one? And he would say yes, and he would tell me about the different hairstyles. But more than anything, and like visually, I ended up just really spending time there and sort of being more interested in the self-care aspect, and how they would go once a week and they would have these conversations, and it would be like a freshening up, and they would build this community in the space. Here, same at Abdel's barber, I photographed this barber shop, and would meet the same people coming in, to like freshen up their fade, their shave, get a gold face mask. It was really beautiful. And for me, it was more about, again, it was like, oh, look at these beautiful hairstyles that I can see and I notice and I appreciate. But then it became more about it's sort of celebrating and appreciating these amazing communities. And through my work, I feel like I see myself in most of the people that I see myself in everyone, honestly. And that is something that is like in me. And I guess when I do work, allows me to feel like, when I'm at the barbershop, I feel like I'm one of them, and I'm sitting there and I spend time, and, I bring my friends and my cousin to get their hair done. And so for me, the community part is like, in a sense, me being part of the community, but at the end of the day, I am kind of like a stranger with a camera that did spend a lot of time there, but had that connection. So there is a connection, but it is a different connection of me being there. Another thing, like living in Palestine was really a very beautiful, eye-opening, and very wonderful experience for me. And one of the main things that made me question photography and what I was doing as a photographer was being in Palestine and going to a refugee camp on an assignment, because I was still taking assignments then, and photographing there, and people being like, you've been coming here for 60 years, you know, you people, photographers have been coming here for 60 years and nothing has changed. And like that really, it really hurts because I'm also, you know, I'm not representing all photographers for 60 years, but I'm there as someone who's also doing work. And it was very painful for me to feel that I was one of those people. So I kind of stopped photographing for a while. And then I did this project that I called Self-Portraits from Palestine. And it was inspired by this project called the Handsworth Project, the Handsworth photo booth, I think. And it's 1977, I think, Birmingham in the UK. And it was this project of also self-portraits. These three guys set up a self-portrait booth in the middle of Birmingham in this area filled with, you know, immigrants. And it was a very, you know, when I saw that, I said, oh, I don't have to take their photos. You know, maybe it would be kind of a fun experience to have people take their photos. But what does that mean again? You know, like, what does that mean in terms of representation? And if I give them the camera to shoot the photo, what is that really them deciding what they want to represent? You know, these ideas of giving cameras out to, you know, the sort of these communities on the margins. It's not like it affects me, this idea of like giving cameras and being like, you photograph for me your world and bring it back, and maybe I'll have an exhibition of the work, maybe I'll make a book out of it. Like, it kills me, and it happens all the time, over and over and over again. And so yeah, I mean, so a lot of my work perhaps it could be in reaction to something like that, but I'm also learning as I go along all the time, you know. But yeah, that was what I was thinking.
Thank you so much. I just sort of had a follow-up question to this. It just made me, it's really wonderful responses. I was wondering about kind of, both of you are talking about kind of art as a process in a sense, and a feeling in terms of, you know, Assia, you were talking about it being cathartic, you know, going through the process of doing these kind of guerrilla events. And Tamara, you've talked about the pain of kind of, you know, this moment in the camps, but also then again feeling in this other exhibition, in this other kind of moment, feeling, you know, like you're everyone in the community. And so I'm wondering, and both of you are also, you know, have been journalists. I was also a former journalist, so and I've also moved away from journalism. So I'm wondering whether, you know, what there is that we get from, that you get from, you know, your current sets of practices that weren't there as a journalist, because in a sense, you know, Assia, you were saying earlier that you mentioned, I mean, you made this great point that organizing is also an act of the imagination, right? So these distinctions aren't very clear, and I would say journalism is also an act of imagination, in that is a world-making act, in that how we choose to describe the world, we can call it an objective genre, but the reality is how we choose to describe the world is a world-making act. And perhaps the distinction is with kind of forms of art is sort of owning that, right? Owning that creativity rather than disavowing it. But it seems to me that in the two kind of answers you've given right now, there's also another aspect of these practices, which is the process of making the art as being an ethical relationship with the communities that you're working with. So I'm wondering if you could sort of talk a little bit more about that, about the process rather than art as an end product, and kind of what that means in relation to the communities you're working with.
Do you want to go, Assia?
Sure, I can jump in briefly. Yeah, I think that the process, I mean, I wouldn't say it's not journalism. It's not journalism as it's been practiced, but also like these are like deeply colonial practices. Filmmaking also, its origin is colonial. So it's like Haley Jarima, the Ethiopian filmmaker, says you're born into this colonial, like the practice is colonial, and for you to like disrupt it, you need to make imperfect work. You need to make imperfect cinema. He has this whole idea. I have like a whole paper of notes from his last lecture that I attended about this, but this idea of like, so you can speak the colonial language, but always operate from your own narrative logic, he says. And so I think, you know, like going off of Tamara, what you were saying about like how what it felt like to be not in right relationship with like, you know, the communities that you're photographing. And I think that for me, at least, I'm like, I still say I do journalism, like that this is like, you know, that these are journalistic tools that I use, and that this too can be journalism. But yeah, I think it's all about like really non-extractive practices, really questioning this relationship and the power dynamic between, you know, the artist, the journalist, the storyteller, and the, you know, like the subject or the communities it's about. I think thinking like, you know, one of the first things is like thinking like the principles that we've been following for this current project are co-creation principles. And it's this idea of like, you're not making work about a community or for a community, but with a community. And what does it look like? What does it look like to leave a community benefit, you know, to intentionally do that, you know. I think a lot about like crediting, compensation, and contracts in all of the co-creation that I'm doing too. Like it's not just about how you talk, but how do you like, how do those values show up in your process? And that includes those things. So and then, yeah, also about like designing a process with community. And so that's something I've done on this, we're doing on this project, where we've composed like a community advisory board, an intergenerational group of people from the neighborhood who, you know, I've been in relationship with in some ways, and they've helped design the co-creation process with the larger community itself. And that's just been like such a generative and wonderful and joyful way of working. I think like even like single authorship is a very Western idea. And there's such joy in letting go of that, you know, because this is such heavy stuff. You know, I was dealing with these documents, it's like deluge of documents for such a long time alone. And it was so like painful. It was painful to open every month. I would get a mail from the FBI and I would open it and put the CD-ROM, and it was like a physically difficult process. And this working in like in a co-creation process has been like, you know, a healing from the pain of working with traumatic material that is so personal, and doing that in isolation. It's very different from how I made my film, which was very difficult to make alone. But I think that it's like a remedy. It's not just anti-colonial, but it also feels good. We practice liberation in co-creating too, in making work together. Then it's not just like a single imagination, it's a collective imagination for a future we want. And so I don't know if I answered your question, but it's been just like really a lovely, warm, difficult, slower, takes more time for sure, but very generative experience. And I also no longer say like, this is not journalism, or like all of it can be, but the very extractive and colonial, like, you know, baggage of these two practices make it difficult. But yeah, it absolutely can be a world where, you know, you pay people for interviews, where they have a stake in the back end of that book that you were talking about, Tamara, or the, you know, the work or whatever. Like, it doesn't have to be. There are so many actually examples. And if you look at like indigenous people and Native Americans here in the United States, like there's so much, like there's a huge body of artistic practice that comes from this kind of like co-creation from indigenous ways of knowing and artistic practices. And anyway, so it's not to say that this is anything new. It's pretty old, I think, also.
I'm gonna do like earlier, ask you a follow-up question, and then I'll give the mic to Yvonne, and you'll be free to Yvonne to answer whichever question you want. But this really, it really connects to a question we had, the three of us, Melanie, Madiha, and I, about institutions and your relationship to art institutions. Let me give you perhaps an analogy. Madiha and I, and also Melanie, are academics, and the tenure system in which we evolve really relies on this idea of single authorship as well. And we can't really get out of it. Otherwise, we don't get the jobs within the institutions that we want. And so we were wondering, first, if your relationship to art institutions you think has evolved since 9/11? Perhaps, in a sense, are you describing here, Assia, co-created community art practices as anti-institutionalist or anti-institutional art practices? Is there a room for new institutional relationship, new institutional boundaries outside the single authorship and outside the art as we've been seeing it? So just a broad institutional question. And remember, you're talking to including a curator at the Highline Art, right?
I'm going to add just a little bit to this question because I'm so curious about the answer from all three of you. But when you're describing these kinds of collectively authored processes, because you're also talking about this installation that you're making physically in the community, what can possibly be offered by arts institutions that are relatively traditional, maybe medium to large size, for a practice like this? Or is there even a role, and what would they look like if they could act, if they were useful?
Is that follow-up for me? I'm sorry, I missed like who you were calling on.
Yeah, if you could start thinking about this project specifically. And
I think two things. Like on the one hand, I think, I've been an independent practitioner and journalist for a long time. And I feel like for a long time, I feel like I and other like artists of color, filmmakers of color have like served as scaffolding for institutions to make them better, to reform their like long entrenched, issues. And that's like, like using your body as scaffolding is exhausting. It covers up the institution. And at the same time, it's draining. So I feel like there's been a very intentional conversation that I've been having with a number of other like practitioners since 2020, really, about divesting energy, about refusal, about putting energy towards like generative things, towards creating alternatives, towards even like non-hierarchical, not creating new institutions, but like just strengthening the nodes between all these, independent mushrooms and all these independent practitioners, and what that could look like as a support system. But that said, also, I think that like there's so much experimentation that can happen from doing something like this independently. And that's like, what does it mean to center your audience as like the primary audience being the co-creators, right? Like, what does it mean to not open it up to everyone? So this is not like a public, this is like really invitation only for people in the community. We're not exhibiting ourselves. We're we're like sharing our work. It's more of like an open studio than an exhibition. I do think there's a value, like we're looking for partners, institutional partners, for like the expanded life of this work, for it to be able to move around, for other communities to be able to experience it. So there's certainly room for that. But I think that being able to do this independently means like not having to publicly open it up. And that's like, the work doesn't have to be publicly consumed immediately. There is this possibility of us creating it and sharing it and thinking about who we want to open it up to. And there's also like, it's, I think, a reaction to this like hyper visibility, that like we can choose to refuse the gaze of others, that we can choose who sees what we make and how we make it, or who's involved in the process, and at what stage we want to open it up to other people. So I think there's all these questions we're playing with, and it's about like comfort. And I think that whole non-extractive piece, like this speaks to that too. Like it feels like for us, and that's really a powerful thing. But also, I mean, it's not that the work will be private, we would love to share it. So I think there's room in like a hybrid models of like, where does the institution, how can the institution support, scaling the work or making it more accessible to other folks, but also maintaining like, the authenticity of the intention for the piece.
Yeah. And Tamara, and then Iván, I have a couple related questions for you with this, and then Assia brought up earlier. But Tamara, you were talking about the process and these experiences, but then there seemed to be kind of a break of like, what happens when we get to the book? What happens when we get to the exhibition? How do you think about product, context, institution in terms of your work? And, this kind of beautiful setup that Assia's given us.
A lot of what Assia said speaks to me also, not just this answer, but the one before. In terms of collective authorship, I think that's a very beautiful thing. And that is something that I guess perhaps you grow towards. Like I now am in a place in my practice where the project I'm working on now is with, it's also working with archive, and the archive that I'm working with, that I'm sort of crowdsourcing from people, is the project is basically sort of like an intervention into a book that basically was my imagination of the Iraqi southern marshes. And so there's a book that I've been sort of working on and intervening in, I can say, when I went to the marshes and I started photographing. This book basically is by two British writer journalists from 1977. And this book affected my personal imagination as an Iraqi of the Iraqi marshes. So I saw the marshes through Nick Wheeler's eyes, and I was affected by that all of my childhood. And I think that this is one of two books that made me probably want to be a photographer and made me into a very visual person. And when I got to the marshes, I realized way later, when I got to the marshes with my own camera, which was like a dream for me, but also a faraway dream. So I waited a really long time to go because I didn't know even how I would, or what I would do, and how I would capture people, and why I would even do it, and how I would talk to them, all of these questions. And when I finally got there, I realized that, I mean, I did take images, and not as, not that many, but I took and I met people and I had experiences. And then I read the book again and I looked at the book again from 1977, and I realized that they were very similar experiences. And I realized that the images were also very similar. And I started thinking, because at the time I said, I want to make my own book. Again, this reactive sort of, person feeling. And then I started thinking, no, let me, have a conversation with this book. Let's have a conversation with this book, in this book. And then I said, not just me, actually, there should be other people having this conversation too. And then so I said, I want to open it up and try to get images, archival images taken at this time in 1977 by Iraqis. And, so I started getting images. And so there was these different levels also of people. There's me, who's Iraqi, but, an Iraqi in the diaspora. Then there's the Iraqis that live in Iraq, but don't live in the marshes. So also sort of visiting from sort of also an outsider gaze. And then there's the ones that live there. And so then there's all of these gazes, and I started collecting these amazing images by Iraqis, and it has been really beautiful to see that, and then feel like, just jumping on what Assia was saying, which is making this book, this future book, because it's still in progress, but making it for us. So it's not really making it for anyone, not making it for anyone else other than the lovers of the marshes, and then, the lovers of, because many people I know, Iraqis in the diaspora and not, have had this book in their libraries. And because it was one of the only books, there's that, and then there's The Marsh Arabs by Wilfred Thesiger. Those two very famous books, but the second one that I'm, the Return to the Marshes, that's what it's called, is more visual. So it's more like images and that. So these two books, or that book specifically, was in so many people's libraries, and mine too, and affected my visual imagination of the marshes, and many other Iraqis as well, and Iraqis in Iraq and outside. So it's been really interesting to sort of go back and go through and just even imagine how this book has affected people. When I first got to the marshes, I was with Jassim al-Asadi, who's the Southern Director of Nature Iraq and NGO in Southern Iraq, in Chabayish. And I was with him the first day. We were sitting in his office, and he was like, do you know this book by Nick Wheeler and Gavin? And he like brought the book to me, and I said, oh my God, Justin, you have this book here? I couldn't believe it. I was like, this is so, anyway. And so even that gave me more of like a push to wanting to do this and to sort of have this conversation. And so, yeah. And then, so really in terms of showing the work and where it goes, I'm at a point where perhaps self-funding and sort of like, self-publishing or publishing with my family, We Are the Medium, which is a publishing house based in Montreal, would be the best way to share the work and have it find its way to people. At this point, this is where I am in terms of how to share work. After the project, what do you do? I would say I've had exhibitions and I've shown my work, and I think having it in book form is a very beautiful thing, and that's sort of what I'm looking at now, because you can also like share it, and I think that for this, if this book does happen in the next year or two, then I don't want to sell it. Like I would like to give this book away and have it find its way around here and there. And by here I meant Montreal, and then there would be Iraq. I'm in between now, but yeah.
These questions, and I'm hearing also from friends who are watching about how generative so many of these answers are, and there are so many artists who are functioning in these ways and trying to either avoid or divest, Assia, as you said, from institutions and push them in different ways, but reinvest in the nodes as you describe as well. Iván, I'd love to open up also if you have thoughts on these topics, but I want to go back as well and pose to you what Assia was talking about in terms of imperfect cinema, or working in these mediums and then offering imperfect answers or imperfect projects within them in the context of your work around monuments. And I'll bring up, this might seem like a bit of a jump, but Iván has proposed for the next Highline Plinth Commission, pigeon that's the size of a Tyrannosaurus Rex, that would be placing this very humorous image or figure in the place of the monument. But you've also clothed Columbus statues and played with that figure in a lot of different ways. So to open up, if you'd like to talk about this question of collectivity in relationship to institutions, but also how you play with imperfection within existing formats that have been given.
Well, I think the institutional question is very complex, because we kind of participate in it, we criticize it, and we kind of try to kind of transform it. At the same time, it's sometimes we don't, we don't see kind of a future. So I think I handle it personally in different ways. There is also, depending the kind of institution. So I mean, let's say cultural institutions, I think, and depending also the country, but it's well, I think there's places where things could happen, but also it's very hard. It's very stiff, and it's very slow. And then, so for example, Assia was telling something about mushrooms, and that's something I really believed in. Not in taking mushrooms necessarily, but no, in the idea of generating communities and that interconnect. And then I had the chance to work in many different places in Europe, in South America, but also in Africa. And then part of my parallel work to my work as artist, Iván, is to work on another project named Espacio Temporal, which is a kind of a hub, where we mainly organize either exhibitions or book presentations or meetings that kind of at the beginning was mainly to kind of make a connection in between the Latin America and Europe art scene and kind of not only art, but also kind of intellectual scene. And then we work in a collaborative way in between places. We try to see who is around Europe to generate something in this espacio temporal, or now we're trying to plan to make a more kind of exhibitions crossing between institutions in South America and then some institutions in for example, in Cotonou, in Benin, or in Ouidah, also in Benin, or in Cameroon, Douala, were also actually places I've worked with and people I work with. So it's more about like people and more than institutions. It's just people who have like projects, and then we think there is a communication, there is sense to make by doing something together. And then, so I think that's a kind of a response to like what like a stiff, stony institution could mean, is to generate this foamy and soft collaboration in between people. And as far as the pigeon, I think it's not unrelated to the institutional part of it, since I talked at the beginning about these decisions about the public space now, who decide what to place in some place and what's a monument. And the idea itself of a monument, it's a very authoritarian idea. So I myself, I try to criticize in different ways, either with humor or either with like directly or physically or mentally, or the idea of monument itself, because I think there is a more horizontal perspective we can have of this notion. And then the proposal of for me, it was very difficult to propose a proposition for like the Plinth Commission, for example, because it's something that is exactly kind of, it's sometimes like I kind of criticize myself, like this idea of a plinth, and then I played in different ways with this idea. So I worked before with the figure of the pigeon as this companion that has seen humanity since very, very long, like evolve, and then this kind of now urban bird, but it's been actually part of many either journalism or like aerial photography, has kind of related to drones also. It's a bit kind of the first drone that ever existed were like pigeons that were used either for war or cartography. So, and I wanted to kind of put the pigeon at the same level, and there's also kind of at the same level of like any other kind of monumental thing in the city, and then bringing this kind of marginal now animal to a kind of more honoring place. Also, kind of, I think the pigeon concentrates a lot of either good or bad perceptions from the people. So I think it was kind of, and then also there is this notion of the scale, but also kind of related to this idea of like that birds are like the last reminiscent of this kind of past ancient also, which is very imaginary world of dinosaurs that used to kind of this very colonial to dominate the world before. So and then us believing we kind of control the thing everywhere. So they say this figure of the pigeon was kind of interesting to me in that idea, just controversing this idea that either we humans are kind of the most important thing ever happened, and then also kind of questioning the iconography that is placed in the public space. No, what are we honoring? What are we celebrating?
Thank you so much. And actually, you sort of you already started answering our last quick question for you all. You know, one of the things that really was striking to us is your relationship to the past, your interest in historical narratives and archives, and sort of, you know, you just mentioned the spatio-temporal. And so like this generation, it seems, is almost cosmological, right? You're asking these big picture questions about space and time, linearity and non-linearity. And our last question for you all, perhaps very quickly, and I think you started answering to us Yvonne, with the pigeons, is what's next in your practice? Perhaps in relation to historical narratives and space and time, perhaps you're moving on to something else, but just we want to give you a chance to talk about your directions, future directions for you, all three of you.
I can go. I started talking about the project that I am working on now, which is the reimagining of the Return to the Marshes, the book. Not necessarily reimagining. Working title now, still thinking about it. I'm in that process now. I'm still gathering archive. I'm thinking about. At this point, I think I'm really interested in the photographic, the sort of colonial photographic histories that we have been looking at and sort of like ingesting for a very long time. And the idea of just rethinking them and working around them and about them and like sort of this idea of questioning. The project that I'm working on essentially questions this narrative, specifically in the Iraqi marshes, and specifically in somewhere that is means a lot to me as an Iraqi, in terms of where my family is from, in terms of me as a photographer, and me as a young Tamara looking through my parents' books. And this book specifically, very, very, it made me want to be a photographer. That's how much this book affected me. And now I'm not angry at the book. I don't want to censor the book. Maybe I did at the beginning when I started realizing, but I don't want to censor the book. I want to have a conversation with it. And so that's where I am in terms of where I'm going next. And it's still in progress. The project is still in progress. I envision it as a book, but anything is possible as the process is the work, and as it goes along, it's very much it will show itself as I go along. But that's where I am in terms of the work, and I would say I'm 30% in, even though I can't see the 100%, but I'm sort of 30% into knowing what I want or where I want this project to be. But where I really want it to be is in its finished the way that it would be finished if it is a book, to have it in the same bookshelf next to the original Marshes, Return to the Marshes, in the Marshes. So at Jassim Asadi's office, in between the books. So that's where I would like to be, and we'll see how that goes. But I think it is possible. So that's where I am in terms of where I'm going. I'll leave it to Assia and Iván.
Perhaps Assia, can you go next?
Yeah, sure. I'm so excited about what you're working on, Tamara. And I just want to say I'm a big fangirl of Picture an Arab Man. It's an amazing, amazing book. I'm waiting for mine in the mail. So, so happy to be in conversation with you and to hear about your practice. I was thinking about this book that is a book in conversation with Camus' The Stranger. It's called The Meursault Affair. So there are books that are in conversation with books, and they're brilliant in making us see things that we hadn't seen before, back to this idea of the invisible. So I'm so excited for the Marshes book. In terms of what I'm working on, I'm thick in the middle of production on this project right now. We're launching our community pop-up studio next month. So I'm really interested actually in methodology right now, about process, about co-creation process specifically. What is it like to, you know, what is this co-creation process of working, you know, from within community, and trying to, instead of moving on to another project, to take some time to like work on a methodology and like learnings from what it was like doing this. You know, like my producer is my sister. It's like all very close, and this whole project is all like working in relationship with people you're like in close relationship with. And I think like there's so much methodology on formal practice and all of this like informal practice that we just like talk on the side about, like, oh yeah, like I'm in relationship with the people I work with, and that we just like don't enshrine it at all because it's like not important, and where it's like too familial. It's, I don't know how, I haven't named it, but this like professionalizing of like the formal, but we don't have any methodology for like these the informal. So anyway, my intention is to spend some time working on that. And I don't know, maybe it's a zine or something that will come out of that can help inform future practice, or actually just like enshrine things that people have been doing for a while.
Hi. I'm working, well, I'm in Rome right now. So that's, you hear me? Yeah. I'm working on this thing, always kind of about public space. So I'm working about how come this city end up with the most obelisk in the world? How come Rome end up with having the most obelisk any city have in the world, either antique Egyptian or other like Roman reproductions, and then how they're being used through history at the beginning as ritual and like kind of mystical objects, and then also of course objects of power and demonstration of domination, and then cultural appropriation, like power, let's say war trophies, and then their help. And now how in modern days they became like sort of an archetype of a monument that you can see in cities like Washington or Buenos Aires, or even in other like in cemeteries and stuff like that. So it's like a whole history through the subject. And then actually I didn't wanted to tell it myself, or like so I've been like exchanging with a lot of people, but I'm doing a film about that. I'm telling this story about a film, and then I'm going to show a film in October if I finish it. And but I wanted to. It's kind of I didn't want to just follow myself and on my own kind of instinct and visions, or like. So I started following pigeons in the city, because pigeons has been a question since some years. So it's actually I'm working with I following pigeons in the city, and also working with a person, Thomas, who is how do you say, like he raised pigeons in the suburbs of Rome, and he's a Polish immigrant. He immigrated like about 18 years ago to Italy, and then they have this community of mostly Eastern immigrants kind of make these pigeon races in the Lazio zone. It's like the zone of Rome. So this at the beginning, this interest of the obelisk is kind of vanishing into a more like spending time with Thomas, and also with the pigeon kind of racing situation, and then kind of following the pigeons at the same time in the public space, and mixing kind of the whole layers of either archaeology that talks about like ancient Egypt and how it's related to like, let's say what they call the more like historical kind of books, and then also like what's happening on the street in every square that they have it, and why they were placed, how they were moved by the popes, or so there's many kind of other political issues involved, but mystical. And then there's also kind of the pigeons, which are like I'm following randomly as the pigeons do. So it's pretty much that's what I'm working on right now, and I'm going also to film with pigeons in this very same place. So I'm building a small studio. I don't know, you know, Cinecittà, which is this famous studio in Rome. So I'm building a small Cinecittà for the pigeons and in this very same place. And that's what I'm working on here.
Thank you so much. I have so many more follow-up questions about public and art and other things, but we're unfortunately out of time. So I'd like to thank our panelists for this wonderful, generative conversation. I'd also like to thank Melanie Kress and Highline Art for this collaborative event. And finally, we'd also like to thank our audience. I also want to give a shout out to several faculty members, including Manan, Ahmed, Marwa, Elshakry, and Brinkley, Messick, who have co-organized this series with us. Technologies of Power has been made possible with the support of the Dean of Humanities at Columbia University, as well as the Center for the Study of Muslim Societies, the Departments of History and Anthropology, and the Middle East Institute. And of course, through the support of our current home institutions, Arizona State University and the University of Toronto. Now, as I mentioned at the top of this panel, this is our final event for this year-long series, and we will be pausing for the summer, but we'll be back in the fall. You can find the full recording of this panel and our other events on our YouTube channel, and you can stay tuned for what we'll be doing next year at our website. So thank you so much for joining us today. Ciao.
Thank you, everyone. See you next time.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was